All right, hello, Denelle.
Hello.
Great to be here with you. So I guess we could, we're going to talk about, obviously, RWA, no surprise. But before that, would you mind introducing yourself and a little bit your background and what your, overall, yeah.
So I'm Denelle Dixon. I'm the CEO and Executive Director of the Stellar Development Foundation. I've been at the helm of the foundation for the last 6 years, 6 and a bit. Before that, I was the COO, and I ran a lot of the Mozilla, so the maker of the Firefox browser, the business and the product, and also focusing around the policy pieces, which is part of why I love what I do, is because we get to do business product, and so tech and policy.
Amazing. So Stellar has set very, very ambitious goals for this year. I think you want to go up to $3 billion of RWA on Stellar.
That's with the B, $3 billion, yeah.
$3 billion. Yeah. Did I say 3 million?
No, I just wanted to be clear.
$3 billion of RWA on Stellar. That is clearly a very, very ambitious goal. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that, and also your thoughts on, generally speaking, the size of the overall pie and how it's been growing tremendously in the past few months. Actually, it's accelerated pretty sharply.
Yeah, I mean, it was so interesting. We've been in this space for RWA since 2019 when Franklin Templeton started building the money market fund on Stellar. And it took a while for them to get approval to do it, and then it took a while for folks to start leveraging it and for them to be talking about it more publicly. They had to run the chain in addition to like the old rails, and so there was all these things they needed to do. We have training wheels. But once that happened, it started to really pick up, and we were number one for real-world assets, which was awesome. But the fact of the matter is, nobody was really doing it because there was so much fear around regulation. There was so much fear around like what's going to happen with MiCA, what's going to happen with the United States, and how that's going to work out. And in the last year, it's been insane. And especially in the last 5 months, everyone wants to tokenize the assets and to put more of these kinds of assets on chain. And I think it's phenomenal to see. We get calls all the time to be able to think through this with people. And from my standpoint, I think it's really wonderful if they're focused on the reason that they need to do it.
I think I remember a long time ago, I invested in a bit bond debt issuance on Stellar, and that was probably 2016 or something. It was like tokenization before tokenization. And that brings me to a question, which is you guys have been super early in the world of tokenization. Initially, and that is back in the 10 years ago, we were talking about tokenizing liquid assets, tokenizing real estate, tokenizing other kind of assets. Now we're seeing obviously more very vanilla assets being tokenized. Can you talk a bit about the evolution of the type of assets that are tokenized? What did you start with, and where we are today?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, it's a lot of validation for us if you think about where we started. We started by saying that you should use tokenized fiat to be able to make payments. And the reason why that's important is because you're sending and receiving the same thing. That volatile crypto assets were complicated for humans to be able to leverage, or businesses to be able to leverage, because you could lose too much in the transfer, even if just 5 seconds. Or just have a difference in terms of the number that you send and receive. And so we've always been focused on fiat, and then gold was a big part of it. And if I think back, I was just talking to someone today about how they're it's so great, we're having securities tokenized on, and Robinhood just announced that they're doing tokenized securities. There was a company that was building on Stellar 3.5, 4 years ago, and that was their whole business. They were tokenizing securities outside of the United States. And they did it so well, they were doing it out of Liechtenstein, and they couldn't make it successful because it was way ahead of the time. Yep. And so it's just, there's so many things that have seen validation. Tokenized real estate, tokenizing oil barrels was something that folks were doing on Stellar 3 years ago. And so when I think about all of these different components and now I see where the world is today, there's a ton of validation. Yeah. This has been something that's been happening there. It makes it very easy to do. It's built into the native infrastructure of the network, and so I love to see now what's happening.
Yeah, no, clearly there's a bit of an inflection point we're seeing in the acceleration of that. And also not just an acceleration in AUM and volume, it's also, I think that we have a much more sophisticated approach to what tokenization means. In the early years, we were saying institutions talk about tokenization, but it was more like a very cautious stance where it was like, yeah, the source of truth is still, our old system, but we're going to tokenize the asset and add this kind of tech layer to do a digital twin of that asset on chain. And actually, we'll talk about it a bit later, but even the use case for that was not very clear. So, now we are seeing natively on-chain assets for which the actual source of truth is the chain. Can you talk? And I know you guys have been doing natively on-chain early on, so can you talk about that?
Well, I mean, it makes me so happy to see when the books and records are actually stellar. And this is what we see with Franklin Templeton, and there's several others that have issued natively on-chain and that are using the clawback functionality and all of the things that you need to be able to have for securities. And so it's really great to see that. The value of it is, of course, that you can think through as an institution, what can I do with the human capital that I had to be able to maintain like 6 different ledgers to make sure that it was all okay. When I only have one ledger that's an immutable record that's the source of truth, you can actually deploy your human capital differently, and you can also deploy your expenses differently. And so I think that is the value, and I know that lots of folks are still doing like the wrapped assets and not doing the full books and records on chain. I think that's already changing pretty quickly. I think that was a lot because of the concern from a regulatory standpoint, and so now that we have like the Stablecoin Act in the United States or the Genius Act and all what's happened with MiCA and lots of different things there, I think that we're going to see more people getting comfortable with it. But the whole point of this technology is that you can actually issue natively, and then you can leverage the value of that native issuance to be able to minimize your workload, let someone else do the work, let the chain do the work, and you can just then reap the benefits of it.
And do you think that beyond the regulatory aspect part, there's also still a part of like, we don't fully trust that this works, like as in we still want a backup and the backup is the off-chain system, and like, are we at a stage now where people do trust that the blockchain is a ledger that is, solid enough and will be there, to serve as a real source of truth? Is that something that is a concern when you talk to institutions?
I don't think that institutions are necessarily concerned with it. They're so used to doing things the old way. I think that you need to sort of blow this whole thing out of the water and say, all the things that we've done historically, do we need to do given the technology that we have in front of us? You can think about transfer agents differently, custodian differently. You can think about all of these things collapsing and being like maybe one entity or leveraging a lot of the assets on chain. So I think it's just like a lot of times what we do is we take the model that we know and we try to move that model to the different place. And that's, I think, a lot of what we've done historically. I do know that with Franklin Templeton, they were required to have the on-chain, the training wheels, I called it, when they had the on-chain on Stellar, and then they also were required to maintain the databases, and they did that for a period of time. I think it was like 6 months or a year or something. And the SEC was like, oh, actually Stellar's more accurate because it's got more decimal points. I guess that's one way to look at it. But I think that when you think about it from that standpoint, like this is actually leveraging the tech stack for what it's really good for. And I do think that I don't know it's like that there's concern about the validity of the ledgers. I think it's mostly that people are just like, but how is it that we're not required to do these things? That they don't want to change necessarily the way they're doing it because it's scary.
No, in some way, the existing system, by being so intermediated, they've fractionized trust in many different ways, and it's reassuring to know that there is always going to be, another pillar of the tripod.
But this is why consensus and how consensus is built, and understanding who the validators are, and making sure that there is some sense of like what you're working with on a network. I think it's really important for institutions that are building to understand that component of it, and a lot of them don't yet, and I think that's going to be a meaningful thing that people need to really achieve, is that kind of understanding and knowledge.
Absolutely, and actually, if we think now about less about the technology itself, but rather like what are exactly the type of benefits that tokenized assets bring. In the early days, when we were wrapping existing tokens of traditional securities, it was more about addressing new pools of liquidity or having kind of a different addressable market in some way almost. Whereas the $1 trillion opportunity is more about disintermediating workflows and having lower OPEX. It's not really a distribution kind of play. It's more of a cost play and
I think it's both still, but I think the OPEX piece is really important for financial institutions. Again, deploying your assets differently. doesn't mean that you're going to save a bunch of money because you're going to do this. You are, but you're probably going to take that money and put it somewhere else and figure out how you can use that money to do something different. They think about different markets. They think about different tools and assets they can leverage. They think about collateralization. How can we get our assets and leverage that? So the greatest thing is that they now have the mind space to be able to think about doing something new and different.
Yeah, actually, I was going to bring up collateral. I mean, collateral is one of the big use cases for tokenizing assets, and obviously also collateral mobility, right? The idea that now that you have this kind of single ledger, you can move collateral around, you can be more efficient, you can manage risk more efficiently. Like poorly managed risk is dangerous. Well-managed risk means that you're more efficient and you like make more. And so this is clearly one of the interesting use cases.
Yeah, and you can see it, right?
Yeah.
You can see what's happening with it, and you can also invest your collateral in different pieces too while it's sitting there. So it's a really interesting way to think through the use of this tech.
Yeah, and when it comes also to the benefits, obviously there's kind of 24/7 trading, which is one thing, but there's also the ability to build financial products that actually yield 24/7 too, in very small increments. Can you talk a bit about what Franklin Templeton did?
Well, I think that this is a really important piece of it. Again, this is like treating this new technology with the old technology view. And you have the ability to do 24-hour settlement, and yet most of the way that money market funds that are issued on chain are done by settling once a day, which makes no sense because if you got out right before the settlement, then you're not going to get that interest for that 24-hour period. So now Franklin Templeton is doing 24-hour returns. So if you got in for a minute, you're going to get that return on the interest, which I think, or the yield, which is really important. But it's not the tech that made it hard. It was the regulatory environment that made it hard. It's complicated for them to figure out oh, how does this work? How do you do that? And so I think that educating regulators is always a really important step. And I think that Franklin Templeton and others have done a really nice job. And so the more comfortable they get with it, the better we're going to see the use of the tech.
And actually having these kind of continuous financial payouts is also changing the way you manage valuation and risk. And that will be something interesting. I think we're going to see some new, fund administration kind of workflows that are going to have to be built to cater for those kind of use cases. If you have collateral that can trade all the time, you will need to price that collateral all the time. You'll need to enable, all of the financial reporting, financial enablement real time.
But I also think it's so interesting because if you think of companies that are very old companies that have never done real-time settlement. So outside of even for payments or think any kind of value transferring cross-border and you've never done real-time settlement, it's actually really hard to get your internal systems aligned with it. So these are just things that we're seeing a lot of momentum on and entities really moving in the right direction with respect to it.
One other area I wanted to touch upon is obviously stablecoin. Stablecoin is, kind of the obvious use case. I think the big talk of town is stablecoin and RWA these days. Obviously, because stablecoins enable payments and enables kind of the cash leg of all the kind of institutional financial setup. You have been, talking about stable assets before stablecoins were even a thing. Can you talk a bit about how you've kind of, in the early days, thought about stable assets and how that evolved until today?
Yeah, well, I mean, when Judd founded Stellar, it was really all about being able to make money move like email, which I know is not cool anymore because email is not fast enough. So if you think money move like whatever kind of chat technology you're using these days. And the part of the rationale for it was to think about those stable assets to move. And so we always talked about stable assets as instead of thinking about using the volatile cryptocurrencies to do it, the challenge, of course, was always liquidity. So in the early days, it was making sure that you had liquidity for these assets globally was really hard. So now it's sort of all come to fruition where now there's more focus on global liquidity. But it was really important to be able to not just build the tech stack that allowed that. And so asset issuance is very simple on Stellar, but it was also really important to build a regulatory framework or a compliance framework natively that made it easy for people to be able to leverage that tech stack. And so I think that was what we did very early on. And again, this is one of those validation points where you're okay, it looks like we were right because now everybody's sort of moving in that direction. We did think about stablecoin issuers though as sort of being they issued stablecoins on the side of their business that they could use in their business. So our anchors, which is what we originally called them, the anchors were stablecoin issuers, but they also were leveraging that asset in their business. Because one of the things we were contemplating at that point is it might be really hard to be a stablecoin issuer and to make money if all you're doing is issuing the stablecoin. Of course, in a positive interest environment, it's not hard, but in a negative interest environment, it is hard. And so it's interesting to see that some of the players who are coming into the space, especially banks, they actually are thinking of that similar model. So they're going to make some money from the yield and from the interest on it, but they're also going to make money using it in their payment methodologies. So I think it's, it's all transitioned. And there's also stablecoin issuers who that's all they do.
And now you have PayPal bringing stablecoins to Stellar.
Yeah, PYUSD is coming to Stellar this summer. They're the perfect example of the way that we thought originally of an anchor, which of course has changed and metamorphosized all throughout this time. But because they have that payments business that they'll leverage their PYUSD in, and think about like how that works, and they've been involved in payments for so long, and then the stablecoin issuance. The thing that I love about what they're thinking through is that velocity is as important or maybe more important than volume. And that is really important to us because we want to see usage. We don't need to see a bunch of people just holding the asset. We want to see people using the asset. And that's an important component when you're thinking about like really making these payments work.
Yeah, absolutely. I know time's up. Can you say a word about the future?
I think that, RWAs are going to be, I think, the future until sort of the next thing that comes to the market. But, when I talked about the fact that we saw companies that were on Stellar that were doing tokenizing securities, and then we're seeing this happen, and this is going to happen real time. We're going to see more and more of these sort of assets be available. And I think it's just going to, I hate to use the word of democratizing finance, but it really, really is. And I think that this is like the promise of the future is actually now here. And I'm just really excited to be a part of it.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.